Welcome to the latest Network Ed Technology and Education seminar. This afternoon I'm delighted to introduce our three guests from Cardiff University. Kathy Jackson is a senior consultant on the Digidol project. Janet Finlay is the project manager and Joe Nichols is the project director. And this afternoon they're going to be talking about the Digidol project, which is putting digital information literacies into practice. But before I start, as usual, I'd like to say a little bit about the technology. We'll be streaming this session, and so you'll be able to interact if you're outside of the room by using Twitter. Indeed, if you're in the room, you're very welcome to tweet as well as asking questions. The hashtag is, as usual, LSE_NetEd, and this will appear on the screen periodically, so you shouldn't really need to forget it. The session will also be available to view afterwards. We'll put it up online on the NetEd site, and so if you don't get a chance to catch it all today, there will be a chance later. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Joe, Janet and Kathy and ask them for a lively, engaging and exciting session.
Lovely, thanks Steve. Cheers. We'll do our best. Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to come and talk to you today. It's great, and tell you something about the work we've been doing at Cardiff. It's quite nice because I feel like we've already established some kind of relationship with LSE, because we've had Jane Secker down to Cardiff before now, just before Christmas, to talk to us about the ANSIL model and how that relates to some of the work we've been doing. So we've already had a workshop, and this is kind of the next stage in the process. So it really is quite, you get the sense of an incredibly exciting time trying to bring information literacy, digital literacy, academic literacies, the whole literacy spectrum together, and how do we actually do that from an organisational point of view. So what we'd like to do is explore that with you today. The project's called the Digidol project. It's the Welsh word for digital. This symbolism will become hopefully more apparent as we go through the talk, in terms of representing that there's a gap that we're trying to bridge through the work of the project and within the organisation, between people who enable the development of literacies in staff and students. And that's really where our focus is some of the organisational challenges around that. We're very fortunate some time ago, before the project kicked off, that the Welsh Government was already sending out the right kinds of messages through the Delivering a Digital Wales and the Digital Inclusion Strategy. Really was signposting the need to develop the knowledge and skills in this area, particularly in relation to employability. And those messages were coming loud and clear to higher education, further education, to get this into the education strategy and to think seriously about how we're going to address it. So we were fortunate, and that gave us a lot of impetus and focus. Now, this is some of the kind of quotes that come out from the Welsh Government and from the media. I don't think it's any surprises to us in terms of the degree of IT literacy that's now needed in employment, and the challenges that many people are facing in acquiring those literacies. But also some feedback in terms of when people do engage with these technologies, they can be quite liberating and really boost people's engagement with their learning. So strong messages there. I've put up a definition of digital literacy. There are many definitions out there, along with information literacy. Some are quite highly specific, but just to come up with a very kind of general one. But it's useful in a sense because it's all embracing. I mean, information literacy, digital literacy are about life skills. So it's learning, working, and playing. It's a holistic approach that we need to engaging with this, and it's developing everybody's digital literacy. And as we talk more about the project, you'll see that we're trying to focus on everyone. It's not just one sector, one domain. So the project was one of 12 funded by JISC in 2011, June 2011. There are 2 projects in Wales, but they're in FE and HE, and they really target all different areas in terms of some focus on curriculum design, teachers, learners, some on administrative staff. We in our project set ourselves rather a big challenge to say, okay, we're going to do everything. It only makes sense to actually do this if you're going to do it at an institutional level holistically. And the real driver behind this was trying to get it strategically embedded, to get a view that this is something that we all need to do and develop together. So if you can think in every area, in terms of learning and teaching and research, you've got administrative and support staff. It's a team initiative in doing the work, and everybody needs to be brought up to speed with these literacies. So we've tried to impact on all of these areas, and we'll explain more of that as we go through. Fundamentally, and I'm sure many of you kind of appreciate this, is a long-term view. It's about attitudes. It's about the way that we get people thinking about technology and information, and especially in the organisation, the need to actually invest and then develop that. So our project is much about changing the hearts and minds of people in the organisation to embrace this. And we're very fortunate in Cardiff to have had quite a pedigree in information literacy as a prelude to the project, where that was being brought into focus. And Kathy, I'm going to hand over to now. We'll tell you more about that.
Hello. Yeah, so we've been looking at information literacy at Cardiff ever since 2001. So I went back to the parchment. I actually found the hard copy of the policy document as I prepared for today, back from 2001. And I was pleasantly surprised, perhaps, at how well the things we talked about in that policy document resonated with the Ansel curriculum and the things that Emma and Jane talked about when they spoke at the first of these LSE Network Ed seminars. So we wrote a policy for our Learning and Teaching Committee in the university, and we said to them about this new concept called information literacy, that we said was part of the academic mission of the university, which at that time was certainly research-led teaching. We quoted the ALA quote, that ultimately information literate people are those who have learned how to learn. We said that information literacy wasn't about just functional skills or technological skills, but were embedded in these higher order capabilities of critical thinking and synthesis, things like that. We specifically highlighted that integration into the curriculum was vital. And part of that, there were two aspects of that. One is that it had to be embedded, that information literacy only makes sense when it is situated within the academic context and the task at hand. And so it's no good having standalone sessions. It had to be integrated, embedded entirely in what the students were having to do anyway. And also the importance of collaborative working partnerships, that we didn't see this as a preserve of the library. We saw that the library could facilitate and support the work of information literacy in schools. And the Learning and Teaching Committee accepted the concept, and over the action plan or the implementation plan of the learning and teaching strategy over the next few years, they had an action to embed information literacy into the curriculum. So through the years, as we've tried to increase the embedding of information literacy, we've always taken into mind these concepts, these things that were like, well, this is how it should be run. So instead, for example, of creating an information literacy tutorial that we could put centrally and that everybody could point to, we didn't go down that route. Instead, we went, and I know many of you are familiar with this already, the Information Literacy Resource Bank. And the concept of this was that we would create bite-sized learning objects that the academic staff could then pick and choose from to embed into the materials that they themselves were creating for their students. So if you're very welcome to go. This is, although it was created for the staff at Cardiff, I know many of you actually have already used things from here in your own teaching, because we tried deliberately not to heavily brand these things Cardiff, but so that they are able to be used. And they're small enough that whatever your pedagogy, you should be able to, sort of embed it into what you're doing. So these are the kind of aspects, but some of them are just cartoons or flow charts, things that for an academic member of staff is a bit of a fiddle to have to create or to find an image. Whereas if we've got these things up on the website, they can just pull them down and just make those information literacy materials that hopefully they are creating for their students more interactive. So that was one thing. Subject librarians then were working with academic staff to, on a course-by-course level throughout the university, to look at how they could situate the development of information literacy for their students at the coalface, at the point in the, of academic practice, how to develop these things in there. Another way that we embedded was not to be too precise about the terminology. Although we would talk to academic staff developing the curriculum about information literacy, what the students would hear is what was familiar to their discipline. So legal research skills, study skills, even information skills, whatever feels comfortable within the discipline. Of course, that has a disadvantage as well, because although many of our students are receiving information literacy development, they wouldn't necessarily know it as such, and they don't therefore recognise it. And equally, many members of staff who perhaps see it in the curriculum don't recognise it because they weren't the ones to negotiate and create the curriculum. So that's something to bear in mind, and has had challenges when we're now trying to develop digital literacies as well. It's not necessarily as familiar a concept as one would have hoped, necessarily. So, 12 years on, how are we doing? Working course by course. Well, every year I ask the subject librarians to look at each course in the university, in their school, and tell me sort of how much we're embedding information literacy. I haven't done it for this year, so I can't say for 12-13, but for last year, these are the figures we came up with. There's a health warning on these because this is from a subject librarian lens. So there may be information literacy going on that hasn't involved subject librarians at all. But if subject librarians were involved in negotiating it or participate in the teaching of information literacy, those are reflected in the figures. And the headline is 66% of students, of taught postgraduate and taught undergraduate students are receiving this embedded information literacy in the curriculum. It goes up to about 3/4 if you count things that I don't quite count as information literacy, but database training, evaluation of websites, which is a step on the way. But as you can see, almost every student is seeing, is familiar with a library and finding information from a reading list, things like that, which, yes, isn't information literacy. I'm not trying to say it is, but it's a step on the process. So subject librarians see all the students or are in contact with all the students, but 66% is embedded. But we're not just talking today about taught students. And I should therefore mention that we do embed the way that we deliver information literacy from the library to not only undergrads but to the whole university. We do try to embed it. So we embed sessions in the staff development programme and in our university graduate college programme as well. And equally, if you look at the graduate college programme, for example, there are other sessions run by people other than the library on areas that, yes, we would all say was information literacy. We also, the subject librarians, aim to see all new PhD students and staff when they come into the university, and we do sessions in all the schools intermittently on aspects of information literacy. So we are doing, trying to reach the whole of the university population. But let's go back to taught students. And I don't know what you're thinking, but the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, 66% is fine. But what about the others? Why haven't, after 12 years, why haven't you actually achieved embedded information literacy into all the courses? Well, the year before those figures, I did actually ask the subject librarians what their perceptions were as to why they hadn't had success, if you like, in all their subjects. And these are the reasons that they came up with. Okay, so it's the perspective of a subject librarian. And first of all, we should say that 38% of students, if you like, of those who had not had embedded information literacy, the librarians felt that they were on the way to getting there. And in fact, I believe them in that a third of those now, in the figures that we've just seen, are now embedded. So if I did that exercise for last year, it would have been a different percentage. So yeah, they are on the way. But let's look at the others then. So what are the other issues that are coming across? Well, 30% says, for 30% of the students, the subject librarians are saying that it's not seen as a priority or a particular need by the lecturer. So we haven't won the lecturer into thinking, yes, information literacy is needed. They'll say that their students have already got these skills. Perhaps they're master's students and they feel that as an undergraduate, they have received these skills and they don't need to work on them further. There's practical difficulties, which I've put in there. If I'm saying embedded into the curriculum, I'm saying that all students have the opportunity to develop their information literacy through their coursework. So if there was like a session, that's fine, but a session embedded into their teaching. But what do you do if you've got a master's course where there isn't a core module? Everybody's just picking and choosing from a huge range of modules. How do you actually reach all the students? So in that case, there's a practical difficulty. Equally with distance learning, sometimes it's not very easy to see how you embed something. You can offer resources, but how do you say that really that has been embedded, that they are actually developing these skills? And then some of it, 12%, is subject librarian time, where the subject librarians are saying, I can't do anymore. I'm reaching these many students, but physically I can't do any more teaching. Or there's a perception that maybe there is more that could be done that isn't being done. So, back to that policy in 2001. I saw that there was so much resonating with the ANSEL policy, ANSEL framework now. But I noticed something else as well, which really stood out for me when I looked back at it last week. The reason we put together this teaching and learning policy in the first place that we presented, that Information Services presented to the university, was a couple of years previously, our IT and our library had converged, had come together. And we were looking for a way of expressing and conceptualizing the teaching that both our IT and the library people were doing into one framework. And we saw information literacy as doing this. Now, back in 2001, we didn't have social media and we didn't have Web 2 and those external tools, but we again saw that the technology that we had within the university, we wanted our university to be able to make best use of. And so we saw all of that as part of information literacy, that which we today would say call digital and information literacy, perhaps. And that's not just a couple of words in the beginning. It came throughout the whole of that policy. What we did, because we realised that our teaching and learning committee may not be won over by the words of information literacy and may not really kind of grasp what it was that we were trying to get across, we painted them 3 pictures, 3 scenarios that would spell out to them what it might look like. 3 little stories of 3 people in the university, and then followed it by learning outcomes of what in that little incident was that they learned about information literacy, so we could tie it into learning outcomes. So we looked at Tom, the first year undergraduate in the School of Astrology. And he was already finding things in his reading list, and he now was doing his first essay, and it was about how he, found that document he wanted to work on had been digitized, and how he found further things for using CD-ROMs, and found some electronic and print journal articles, and then he went off and went to Word, and he had to learn how to reference or put the references in Word and things like that. The second one, person we featured, was Helen, our PhD student in astrology. And I want to just read out a little bit of that, and remembering this is 12 years ago, and just it's a bit of a, sort of where we were going. Helen is a year into a PhD, looking at the role of astrology in medicine in Elizabethan society. She discovers a recent article analysing a physician's astrological casebooks of thousands of medical consultations in London. The research was funded by the ESRC. She remembers from the research training scheme at the beginning of her course that the data from the ESRC-funded research is often deposited in a data archive. So she can't quite remember where that is, and so she browses the subject-related pages, and she finds a link to the data archive. She reads the help pages, and before using the Byron catalogue, that might take some of you back a bit. Then she registers with the data archive, downloads the relevant data, and proceeds to analyse the data using SPSS. But she realises some of the graphing facilities is a bit poor, and she would do better off, perhaps, her friend told her about Excel, this wonderful new package that would help her with the graphs. Okay, this is a long time ago, admittedly. But Helen contacts the library, and the subject librarian gives her documentation about an Excel course that's coming along in a few weeks' time. And meanwhile, she puts Helen in contact with an Excel specialist. And she goes on and, does wonderful things. So you can see even in that, there's so much the digital side as well as the information literacy side in there. And then finally, we had Ivy, our administrative support person, whose professor had asked her to create some PowerPoint slides from the drawings that he had created. Again, this is a different era, but she had to sort of learn how to find images on the web, and she also had to learn how to search for sort of the background to people that he would be introducing at the conference that he was going to. So the idea really there was information literacy, but looking back, you think, gosh, this is really the digital and information literacy together. So does that mean that we actually really got going with digital literacy as well as information literacy at Cardiff? Well, you can see we had quite a bit of success with information literacy, but I can't really say that digital literacy has been massively widespread and embedded within the curriculum so far. Why was that? Well, I think it was down to organisational issues. Subject librarians already had a very close relationship with their schools, and that was the organisational model. Sadly, IT staff didn't have the equivalent model, and subject librarians weren't being pushed to develop their digital literacy to provide that to the school. That was beyond their remit. The IT trainers had to contend with a business case, having to generate money through their training courses, and they were focused very much on research and staff training. And so the undergraduate or the taught students weren't ever really getting that level of promotion of digital literacy through the way their curriculums were designed. So it's been really welcome to be able to come back and revisit digital literacy as part of the Digidol project. And so I'll pass over now to Janet, who will sort of spell out how we're now trying to tie it all back together again now.
Oops, caught up in the wires. Okay, so Digidol has started from, as you can see, a very strong foundation in information literacy at the university. And when the project started in July 2011, at the same time, the new university education strategy was issued. And that, we're still working with that education strategy at the moment. And that education strategy is very interesting in that it brings together the information literacies, you can see there at the bottom of that list, digital literacies, and also academic literacies, professional literacies. And it encompasses all of those under the term of learning literacies. And looking at the little diagram at the side there, you can see that we see these three things as blended. It's very, very difficult to pull them apart and treat them separately. If you start talking about information literacy, you very soon come upon technology. If you start talking about technology, you're very soon coming upon information tasks and academic tasks. So it doesn't make sense to us to treat them independently. So within the university education strategy, we have this concept of learning literacy. So we're starting from a really good base there. Since then, and with input from the project, we've also been looking at how we can get the learning literacies, including digital literacy, embedded in other strategies at the university. So here we've got the INSERV's digital information literacy strategy, which was a year later, and just recently, which has actually just been approved but hasn't yet been released, the digital and social media strategy. And both of those very strongly point to the need to have digital literacy. So from the point of view of the strategic approach, we're from the project's point of view, we're doing pretty well. And that's partly because we've got a strong support from senior management, which is really critical to this whole process. This example is Hugh Jones, who's the COO, Chief Operating Officer for the university, and he blogs on a regular basis and is a strong supporter of the use of digital technologies in communication, supporting the way that the university works together. And we've also got support from other senior staff, including the Vice-Chancellor most recently, pushing the idea that we need to have an integrated approach to digital literacies among staff. So far, so good. We've got the commitment to digital literacy, learning literacies in a strategic sense, and from our senior staff. But we've still got a communication gap, and here we come back to the graphic that Joe introduced at the beginning. On the one side, we have service providers. We have the subject librarians, we have the IT staff, training staff, we have career services and so on, who have things that they want to offer in terms of information literacy, in terms of digital literacy. On the other side, we have staff and students who may not recognize that these literacies are relevant to them. They may not recognize what the literacies are in the first place, but even if they do, they see them as not really relevant to their discipline. It's not part of the thing that they came to university to study, or it's something out there that's really, the student should already have, or it's somebody else's responsibility. So there's this communication gap that we have, and what we've been trying to do on the project is look at ways in which we can address that communication gap through modelling integrated learning literacies, to produce a framework which allows us to talk, allows us to have that conversation between these two groups and bridge that gap. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how that model has been developed, what we're doing with it, and then I'm going to hand over to Joe for some more practical applications of it. So when we decided that we really needed to have an integrated learning literacies model, or framework as we've been calling it, rather grand, we went to the drawing board literally, and a group of us, including people from information literacies and digital literacy interest, got together and had some discussions about, well, how would we represent that? What were the key things that we needed to be able to say? And the driver behind all of it was to give us something that would allow us to go to academics and actually have that conversation about how they could embed these literacies within the things that they're doing anyway. So there was a kind of curriculum focus to it. And so, of course, we looked at Ansel, and we looked at other frameworks that you'll be very familiar with. And we kept on coming back to this thing, and the diagram at the back is the whiteboard in our office, or it was at the time. It's now changed to a different version of this. But it became very complicated, and the subject librarians who were involved in this process were looking at us and saying, this isn't going to help us. How are we going to take this to academics? They're just going to kind of throw their hands up and go, wow. You know, so, and also how we're going to take it to the other subject librarians. So we had to look for something much more straightforward. And so we ended up with going for something which was really sacrificing some of the complexity of the issue and some of the complexity of the problem for the simplicity of communication. And in the end, we went back to a model that we've been looking at a lot in the project and in the program, indeed, in the Digital Literacies program, which is Helen Beetham and Rona Sharp's model from 2009 for developing digital literacies. But the way that we're applying it, we're looking at it in the context of learning literacies. So we've also added to this model a fifth layer. So at the bottom there, we've added the layer of awareness. So I don't know how many people here are familiar with this model. You just see how many people have seen it before. Okay, a few, but not everybody. So the idea here is that this is supporting the development of literacies, and be that digital or learning literacies. And in order to develop those literacies, a person needs to have, in our model, our version of this model, awareness. First of all, they need to be aware of what's out there. They need to be aware of what they need to know. They need to be aware of the possibilities, if you like. When they're aware, they have to have access. So it's no good teaching people things, teaching people to use particular technology if they can't access that technology, teaching people to do particular searches if they don't have access to the facilities to be able to do that. So they have to have access. They have to be given access, and that might include to particular software, it might be to particular people, it might be to particular training, it might be to an infrastructure. So it might be that they have to be able to access a network so they can use their own laptop, something like that. Once they've got access and they're aware of things, then you can teach skills. And skills is about I can do something. So I can use a particular piece of software. I can do a particular search. I have the operational skills to be able to do it. But that's not enough. And that's often the point at which the training that we were looking at from the service side was stopping, that it was really stopping at that skills thing. We'll give you a course on PowerPoint. We'll give you a course on using, you know, whatever it is, whatever database it is. But that's focusing on skills rather than on, well, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to apply it in the context that you're working in? So the next level up is practice. And it's looking at practices. I do things. So in applying these, I can apply the skills that I've got to be able to do something meaningful in my area. So I can apply my information literacy skills, my digital literacy skills, to produce a presentation that is relevant to the discipline that I'm working in. And that might be bringing together lots of different skills, which we'll come back to a little bit later. And then the final thing, the thing that we're hoping that people will develop over time, is the attribute of I am. So it's about being confident. It's about having the confidence, having the curiosity, having the mindset which says, I'm going to be able to do these things. I'm going to be able to use these literacies. I'm going to be able to have an understanding of the meaning of information, have an understanding of technology such that I can play with it, I can try things out. So having that attribute is very much a mindset, and that's what we're wanting to develop in our students and staff. So we moved back to this model, and the simplicity of it was really helpful. And everybody felt that they could buy into it, everybody felt that they could understand it, and most importantly, they felt they could take it and explain and talk around those things, and it would help them to talk about the literacies that we were interested in. So what we've done, we wanted to be able to map against each of these areas different attributes, different literacies, descriptors of literacies. And so we sort of map it onto a framework like this, and I'll show you a couple of examples of these filled out in a second. So we went onto this, and we decided that we would do this mapping. But it became clear that it wasn't so simple as that. So when you're thinking about practice and what it is you do, we felt that you could identify different levels that you were interested in, that you might want to actually define literacies in terms of these different levels. So at the base level, down here, you have core tasks, and there's some debate about what those core tasks should be, but essentially the core tasks are the things that are common across a whole set of practices. So you can build up, they're the building blocks for the practices. They're the things that you would do, you would be planning to do those things in a whole range of different contexts. And so we decided we had a lot of debate about which core tasks we should include, and these aren't necessarily fixed in stone, but we decided to simplify it down to 5 core tasks. So finding information, managing information, manipulating it, producing or creating it, and sharing it. Now there's a lot of complexity behind that, there's a lot of nuances we might want to tease out of that. But just to keep it simple to start with, we identified these core tasks, and we felt that we would be able to map the literacies that are associated with each of those tasks in advance of any discussion. So we could take those along with a discussion to be able to say, well, if you've got a student who you want to them to develop their skills in sharing, in communicating, in something to pass information on, then here are the literacies that we might expect, or some of the literacies we might expect them to have, and then that's the start of the conversation. Then at the top level, you may also want to define what you see as the relevant literacies in terms of, for instance, a Cardiff graduate, or it might be an LSE graduate, or it might be a taught MSc student, or it might be a student in biosciences at a particular university. It may be something quite disciplinary, but it's at that level of saying, this is where we want them to get to at the end of their course. And so you might therefore bring in descriptors that come from QAA, you might bring them in from program level learning outcomes. But again, you could define those, perhaps in negotiation with the academics, to say this is where we're aiming for. And that leaves us with practices in the middle, which help us to move from a kind of operational understanding of how to do these core tasks through to the high level, through the practices that are relevant to a particular discipline. And there's a few examples there would be lots of those. And that's the point of negotiation. So that was our sort of starting point with this model. And we then went and we did a bit of a mapping, and here's a concept map, this was fun to do, of taking a whole range of different frameworks, Sconnell's digital literacy lens, the ANSEL curriculum, a whole set of different frameworks, some information literacy focused, some digital literacy focused, and we mapped them against the core tasks and against things that were practices that were much more at a slightly higher level that couldn't be defined within one task. So we mapped them in this way. You don't need to worry about the detail of the situation, but it's interesting. This is ANSEL, so this gives you an idea of the representation of those core tasks within the model. It was quite interesting from that point of view as well. And from there, we defined descriptors for each of the core tasks. This one is managing information. Again, don't worry about the detail of what this says. I'm going to zoom in on a bit of it in a second. But against each of the levels in the Beetham framework, we would define descriptors which were associated with managing information. So the bit at the top says developing learning literacies in the context of managing information. And you've got descriptors at each level. And those descriptors are really condensed versions taken from each of those different frameworks, and we combined them together if they were talking about the same thing and used a common language, so a consistent language to talk about it. We also had ones for the learning literacies in a Cardiff graduate. So this is one version, and we had another version as well. And so they would have things like, so this is the skills level. Yes, this is the skills point, the one in the middle. I know what the functions and features of software applications are and how to use them. I know what the functions and features of the computing device are and how to use them. And so they're quite generic things that we might expect a graduate to have when by the time they finish the course. And as you can see at the top and bottom there, you've got some of the practices and you've got some of the access descriptors as well. And so what we've got now is a set of all the 5 core tasks defined and 2 examples of what we might have at that high level. And we took these to the Information Literacy Away Day, which Joe mentioned at the beginning that Jane and Emma also took part in. And we offered them up to the subject librarians and to some of the IT staff who were there, who were involved in education. And we really wanted to see what they felt about the model that we were proposing, that fledgling version of it, whether they really understood the principles that we were using, whether the descriptors made sense to them, and if there were things missing or things that they felt shouldn't be there. So we had them critique them, in a sense. And so there was lots of diagrams with post-it notes, as you usually have at these sorts of events, and we ended up getting some very useful feedback from that. And so we then moved, there were 2 things that came out of that, primarily two things that have influenced the way we've developed the model further. The first was there was a concern that the triangle, the pyramid, suggests a movement upwards to a pinnacle. So it suggests that you move up there and then you reach somehow nirvana at the top, you know, and you're able to be, you are then literate in some way. And so we thought that was a fair point, that was suggesting that you would reach that point and then you'd finished. But actually what it is of course, when you reach the point in one area, you become much more aware of all the other things that you need to know, and so therefore you're sort of moving around. It's much more cyclical. So we've suggested that now by having this sort of flow going round the triangle. And hope that that deals with that issue, that we're not suggesting that you can reach the sort of the top and have finished. The second thing that there was a concern about, and again we felt that this was valid concern, was it became obvious that it was really quite difficult to talk about practices and attributes in relating to core tasks, because once you got to the practices and attributes part, you were talking about multiple core tasks, not just one core task. So if you're talking about finding information, what practices would you be talking about that didn't also involve some other element, sharing or whatever, because the practices tend to be applying lots of core tasks together. And so instead of having the separation and applying the whole framework, the whole pyramid to it, we thought it's actually more helpful to embed that within the pyramid. So we've now got this version of Helen and Rona's framework, which I don't know, have they seen it? Did they see it? Yes, Helen's seen it. Yeah, Helen's sort of seen it in passing, where we're embedding the core tasks between skills and practices. So in a sense, you can see the things at the bottom, the awareness, access, skills, support the development of awareness of those, that the literacies are involved in those core tasks. And the core tasks support the things above them. And so that allows us to then still define the core tasks, but we're not getting the confusion of, well, where are practices fitting with that? And the practices is the part where we still need to have that negotiation. So what constitutes a practice is very much disciplinary based. So if you say, I want to give a presentation, giving a presentation in a science subject is a very, very different thing to giving a presentation in an arts subject, humanities. So there may be some disciplines where it is normal practice, good practice, to talk, as I'm doing here, to slides and just talking off the top of your head. There are some disciplines where that would be considered to be extremely bad form, where you had not prepared properly and you should really be having a read paper. You should produce something that somebody else, if you weren't there, could actually come along and deliver and read it for you. And that's the expectation in some disciplines. Now, clearly, those things have to be negotiated, therefore, as to what's appropriate for particular students in a particular disciplinary context. And so what we're looking at is how we can use conversation to, between the academics and the service providers at this practice level to help to perform that negotiation. I'm going to hand over to Joe to talk more about enablement as conversation.
That kind of nicely leads into, having gone through all that work to come up with a kind of conceptual framework and model around learning literacies, to leading into then some of the kind of more organisational challenges that we've kind of faced up to in the project. So back to this kind of representation, this communications knowledge gap between staff and students. Now normally I'd get up and move around all over the screen, but I'll stay here because the camera won't want to move. On the left-hand side there, you can see staff and students really immersed in the challenges of their learning and work. So they have a whole collection of kinds of problems and tasks that they're dealing with. And they're looking to service providers to help them with their work by providing a whole host of different kinds of services. Now, I've characterised those as tools, people, content, and processes, business processes. By business processes, I mean kind of things that are done on behalf of somebody, a system that does something or a person that does something, a work activity. And in an ideal world, what happens is all the internal service providers provide all that's needed for staff to meet their requirements and job done. The reality, of course, is what you've got are many unfulfilled requirements. And the challenge in terms of supporting people is actually, how do we go about finding out what it is that people need? What are they missing? What are they not understanding? What are they not aware of? Again, looking to the future, is a challenge for service providers within an institution, is to also enable people to become aware of what's available outside the institution. So those cluster of arrows at the top, again, with tools, people, content, and processes. Increasingly, there's more opportunity outside of the institution as well. And we need to look at mechanisms, ways of having conversation with students and academics that make them aware not just of internal services, but external services as well. And there's a real challenge here about this communications loop and how does it happen? It has to happen across the institution for everybody, really. And what we refer to this as part of a kind of conversation loop and a kind of an enablement, a cycle of enablement that's facilitated and driven by service providers. So what I'd like to focus in on is just bring you back to the idea of where this model fits in. And there's none of this is kind of defined. There's lots of questions up for grabs here in terms of, obviously you'll be asking yourself about roles and responsibilities and who should be doing what around this. But you can see, if we're going to make people aware of the tools and the services and map those to what the requirements, the learning tasks are, we've got to make them aware of what's available, facilitate access, help them develop those skills, and embed them and contextualize them into meaningful practices, and to develop that kind of whole culture shift around working with technologies, working with information. Now, there's some big question marks here in terms of who does this. Now, we don't have the answers yet. What this model and this way of looking at it is framing the questions to kind of ask back at the organisation and the institution. That if there's recognition that people need to do this kind of thing, how do we relate that back to librarians, IT specialists, and people across other services in the institution? And as Janet said earlier on, traditionally, we've gone so far up in terms of we create awareness around what we provide internally and facilitate access and do some skills training, IT skills training. But then it kind of tails off in terms of how do we really get useful practice out of using these tools, as Janet was indicating around the kind of different kinds of ways of presenting. What's the relationship between service providers as enablers, as information literacy specialists, digital literacy specialists, and having that dialogue with staff and students to kind of embed it in practice. And that's what we're trying to highlight here. So one of the things we're facing, as I said, outside of the organisation, with tools, people, and content, there's a whole growing mass of potentially valuable services with far more capability than we've ever experienced before. How do we surface that opportunity to staff and students? It's changing every week. So one of the things we're thinking about, and in the original work packages for the project, we kind of just focused on building a repository, we said, of resources to support learning and teaching. But we quickly recognized that the bigger challenge is actually enabling the kind of few bottom levels of that pyramid, awareness, access to these resources. So this is a work in progress where we're using concept mapping tools to show some of the relationships between external services. This is primarily tool-related stuff, but you can just think about it in terms of types of content, people in terms of expertise, and processes, services out there that will do things for you. And what we're trying to do here is trying to illustrate some of the mappings to components of the task. So Janet was talking about those core tasks. Now, if we think about this core task as being finding information, obviously you're looking at lots of different things you might want to find data information about, and types of images, journal articles, audio files, searching for people, different types of content, bookmarks, all forms of search. Now, what people don't readily realize are all the kinds of media and search activities you can engage with. So we're trying to find a way of how do you actually surface that and increase awareness and access. Now, just the same challenges are being faced up within the institution. So this is just these IT services, okay? At the moment, we're just going through formulating what they're calling a business service catalogue. Now, the primary driver behind this is really internal to IT services to sort out organisationally who does what, and what do we offer people, and who's responsible for it. But at the same time, the hope is that having a catalogue like this might surface greater awareness to people about what IT offers. But there's a big challenge here, and I think hopefully it's becoming clearer and clearer, is that the bit that's missing is an understanding of what it is that people do that maps to the things that are on offer. So one of the things we're trying to do in this project as well, and again this is being done in the concept mapping space, is struggling to think about how can you represent tasks and problems that people do. So this is looking more at the kind of middle layer that Janet was on about. So types of tasks, so types of presentations, types of meetings, types of writing tasks. And then if you were to engage with those, how would they map back to the services? So we're going to try and tease apart what it means to run an effective meeting using different types of meeting, and illustrate and different types of presentations, so that you can get the separation. So what's going to happen, you see, next week there'll be a new presentation technology coming along. And what you want is a way of mapping it back to what it is that people are currently thinking about, so they can see the opportunity afforded by new tools. And the idea is that we'll do this through some browser-based interface. As I say, this is a work in progress. We haven't got the ideal interface at the moment. What we're doing is kind of working up the knowledge base behind it, the relationships, the content, and then hoping to prototype it in terms of theme it through a form of task practice to the kinds of resources. Ideally, you'd have something that was available. I think what this kind of tool has to do is support kind of browse recognition type activities and not just kind of focus directed search, because people talk a lot about the kind of serendipitous experience you have with new tools and actually coming across something and saying, oh, I didn't think of that. That looks interesting. And what we're trying to do is then make it more relevant by surfacing the kinds of practices that people will do, so they can browse this and identify, become aware of new things, not just technology, of skills that people have, the expertise that people have, and content. This became really apparent the other day when I was in a meeting with some librarians in the health libraries, and there was a conversation going on around redesigning web pages. One of the things that they've recognised is how to make people aware of what it is that librarians do. So the skills that they have, the specialist expertise that each subject librarian has, the tutorials that they run, the resources they provide, and the tools and services that are there. And what we have at the moment is a website with all these disparate locations of all these descriptions. But really what we want is all the join between it. And that's the challenge, is making all that join and then surfacing and making it relevant to somebody so they know what they need. And service providers need to do more to understand what it is that lecturers and researchers and students are doing in order to make their services more relevant. So, one of the most fundamental things we realize behind all this is all very well having these conceptual models and things like that, and it helps to have the communication, the conversation, get everybody thinking in the same space, and we've done a lot of work there. But if we mention those words, things like scalability and sustainability, it's all about the conversation. All of this requires contextualizing. Therefore, you've got to have the ability to talk to staff and students on a regular basis and get their input, get their engagement. So one of the things we're running within Cardiff is a internal social media platform to create, in a sense, social spaces. And we're working with people in the schools to initiate and facilitate these conversations. So I'll show some examples later on in terms of the kind of people we're working with. But in these social spaces where we have, for example, research support officers in a school that we're working with so that they set up and kind of keep these conversation spaces open. We don't really want it being driven from the centre. What we're trying to do is get ownership and responsibility amongst the academics to identify what it is they want to know about. Because there's a whole wealth of learning literacies and tools and technologies out there, but what is it that's going to give them real value? And the only way we can find that out is by actually having a conversation with them. So we've created these online spaces and invited researchers in, and then the service staff from potentially any area of the services can come into that space, be invited into that space, asked to provide their input, pointers and things like that, and asked if they can provide a session on something. Now, the idea is that this will be the kind of channel of communication bridging between service providers and staff and students. And then we bring into the melting pot the methodology around the learning literacies framework and making that conversation happen. And hopefully, so it's not happening at the moment, this is in terms of the project, is you get other services involved. Not going to happen overnight. They're going to need a lot of support to do that. But the thing is, it doesn't really matter, because what you'll have there is continuity in what you've discussed. So if somebody comes in later, at least they can see what's happening. It also gives you the possibility of kind of cross-fertilizing between schools, so taking up things that have been developed and delivered within one context and moving it to somewhere else. So all these conversations we're aiming to get happening, really, this is where the future lies, it's driving in getting these communities of interest in practice around the learning literacies in context. So what's appropriate for a researcher, what's appropriate for an educator, to get that happening. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced, you could probably spend the rest of your lives on a kind of roving roadshow, doing workshops and presentations across, but it's ad hoc, it's occasional, once or twice a year maybe. But what we've got to get to is in a space where it's kind of, the conversation's happening all the time. And it's just as much a challenge then for internal services, in terms of how do all the service providers make the join? So we've got to think not just between individual, like IT to school, library to school, it's across, and it's across research support, student support, HR, research, it's the whole thing. We've got to kind of find a way to make sure that we're joined up in terms of how we're providing things. And that is the organisational challenge, is that so often it's just single points of contact. And nobody's privy to somebody else's conversation or aware of the requirements. So we need a common space to do that. Now, I'll just give you one or two examples then of the kinds of engagement that we've had with the schools. This is quite an innovative solution driven by a student, actually, an ex-student, a graduate called John Scott in biosciences in Cardiff. And he worked with final year students, I think mainly, to set up what he referred to as a shadow module. And this runs parallel with the main curriculum. And it was presented as an opportunity to undergraduates to develop their IT skills, to focus on some aspect of what was being studied in the main curriculum, some kind of process or cell metabolism or something like that. But really what it was an opportunity to develop their IT skills and ways of expressing themselves around the technology. So he set this effectively a club up and got students in there, and they had an opportunity then to present that back to everybody. So it was a select group of people, but what's happened is it's generated a lot of interest as a way of, because the real struggle here, why is it happening outside the curriculum, is because the curriculum's packed. And we've got a real challenge in actually getting it to the point at the start when curriculum's designed and learning activities designed to embed these sorts of things. I'm not ignoring the fact that we need to do that. But it's wonderful when students are taking their own initiative and making this happen as well. But it's highly dependent, of course, on having that motivated and skilled undergraduates to run with it. But it was extremely well received. The other work we've been doing is working with the library recently ran a whole kind of one-day workshop and looking at social media, a broad scope social media, in terms of what does it mean for the library, what does it mean for library staff, what can librarians do to enable others to develop the knowledge and understanding of social media. And one of the activities that we did, in fact, I cut up a whole bunch of cards that were had various kinds of social media labels on them with the web addresses, and got people in groups to basically sort them through. So the groups are a kind of mixture from people who have never used any social media, have no interest whatsoever, right up to people who are really quite immersed in it and know a lot about it. So mixing up the groups and getting them to sort through the cards into piles in terms of ones that they had used, ones that they had heard of, and ones that they didn't know anything about. And then what I put up were questions around types of work activities. So finding images, storing images, finding various content, managing it, storing it, sending it, publishing it, various tasks. What would you use? So what was interesting is that there generally was always somebody in the group that knew something about one of the tools that could be used, and that started the conversation. So all this was about raising awareness, beginning the first steps to access. So somebody would have a laptop or a tablet computer at the desk, and they had the opportunity to search on that, ask me questions, and then we could actually explore what it meant in terms of their work that they were doing. So what opportunities might this social media involve? That's all a prelude to imagine the sessions that you then go on to do and say, well, actually, this is particular technology I'm interested in. Then we look at the skills and practice side at a later date. So this is really just getting people on board with the early stages. Another one this is actually a product. This is one of the workshops that came out of one of those online communities we did in the social media platform for the Cardiff School of Planning and Geography. And we went to the researchers there and said, what is it that you think you would benefit from? And they came back saying they want to know more about how they could use social media to improve their online presence and their impact around their research. So Rebecca Mogg there, librarian at Cardiff, we worked with her and she ran a session on social media that was requested by them, running a short lunchtime session over a couple of times, I think it was done. And what we're trying to do is really start to work with the researcher development framework, the VTI research development framework, to kind of structure and get the researchers to take more ownership about what it is they want some development on. And this is also being done in the postgraduate college as well for postgraduate students. And again, we've got librarians running specialist sessions on a whole range of social media technologies and into introducing them to that. And this is one of our success stories at the moment. Successful from the point of view that our engagement with the careers employability staff in the university has kind of gone full circles. From us to actually raising their awareness and understanding about it, for them to actually get really the bit between their teeth and coming back to us and saying, we're really interested in this, we want to make it happen, we see the value of it. The whole context of getting employers involved and getting academic staff to realise and embed this in the course, it's a really rich area. So we had a really good opportunity within the Way Day that they were running, and we explored, again, coming back to this, the pyramid model, getting them to think about what their own needs were in terms of their learning literacies to actually get up to speed with this, as a prelude to then thinking about what role might they play in developing the learning literacies of staff and students. So there's this recognition that you've got to invest in staff first before they can put them in a position where they've got the confidence to actually run out and develop it and help develop it themselves. So just to summarise then, some of the key things that we've kind of learned along the way. And the project finishes in June, July this year, so we've got still some loose ends to tie up, but we've got some clear pointers as things that have been important. Obviously, the fortunate position we were in to build on established expertise and knowledge around information literacy, and that initiative, that awareness was a great impetus for us. Getting the mention of the learning literacies and all the digital and information literacies in the strategy was an absolute godsend, wonderful. And that really comes back, obviously, to having the right people in the right place at the right time, but you've still got to feed them information but it was very timely for us to have that in the education strategy. And getting those key decision makers and gatekeepers on board, lobbying the kind of sponsors of your project, the champions of the project. You're not going to get everybody, and we're far from convinced everybody, but we have got some players on our side that are willing to fight our corner. The real importance over and over again of making sure this is contextualized and getting ownership within the schools and by the academics. I think we would say very strongly that our task practice focus of all of this is something that we're quite keen to pursue and anchor a lot of our work around, because we feel that that really provides the main context for making sense of all these learning literacies. And of course, this mind from an organizational point of view is the sustainability and scalability of what we're trying to do. The Knowledge Hub, I think it's frightening in terms of its scale and in terms of its maintenance. Conceptually, it fits in the right place, but there's some significant challenges in building that and maintaining it. We're aware of that. We're just going to try and proof of concept and see if that works. Getting these conversations happening. So part of what we need to do is develop our own staff to be able to initiate and facilitate and support these spaces and feed into them. And all of this is really something I've not laboured at all, but you could have another talk on, is the requirement for staff development, on service staff, for academic staff, to find a way of actually embedding this in what they do. And there's some big question marks of whether any of this will happen without a real investment in staff development. And so it's really trying to see these communities of interest in practice that I think will give us a kind of the focus for future work. And they start coming back to us and asking what they want. So that's it. Thank you very much. I hope that's been of some interest, and we're open to questions. All of us.
Thank you very much indeed for sharing the work of Cardiff. You've certainly been busy over the last few years.
Yeah, it's been fun though.
And thank you very much indeed. I'd like to start off by asking a question. You mentioned your project is coming to an end in, 3 months? It's often quite a difficult phase of transition between a project into developing something which is established, embedded, and ongoing. Do you think you've actually made that leap?
I think we're in the process of kind of that bridge stepping off. A leap of faith maybe, but we're doing a lot of groundwork in terms of, as I say, having key people within the organisation, the kind of decision makers on board helps, so they're fighting our corner. What we've been doing are writing proposals that map to things like roles and responsibilities. So, this won't be sustained if we don't get individuals who can actually have this as part of their remit, part of their job. What might happen is the whole language might change. I mean, digital literacies doesn't mean a lot, really, to many groups of people. So one of the things that works on the service side is enablement. They can actually, service providers, IT specialists, they actually believe they do enable. What perhaps they need to understand is that there's more in terms of the knowledge and skill sets to develop around that, and more to be done. So in terms of the future, it's in the strategy. It's still in the strategy. It's still in action plans beyond the life of the project. What we're trying to do now is ensure that it's in roles and responsibilities and future practice. So small steps yet, but we've still got some time yet.
Thank you for that. Before I hand over to others for questions, could I just remind you that you please wait for the mic to go around. It's not necessary for this room, I know, but it's so people who are viewing the live stream can actually hear your question. Question.
Hi, I was interested in the social media platform that you've got for conversations to take place. And you mentioned you've got local contacts to keep it active. How active is it actually?
Well, it's only officially gone live, I think, middle of last year. Prior to that, it was being trialled and prototyped mainly with information services. So that was IT, library, media. So there's a corpus of information there. And what's happened in the last few months is it's really taken off. I wish I should have had a graph to hand. But one of the big factors is having like our chief operating officer saying he believes in this is the future. So he's in there blogging, and what happens when that happens is you get other senior players coming into the space. So it's slow growth, but it's actually happening. What we do believe is that we need to help educate people to be able to facilitate, manage, stimulate these conversation spaces. That's not going to happen overnight, and that's going to take time. So one of the things I think the idea of a community manager is a key to actually sustaining this, and it's somebody that actually is an investment in the stakeholder group. So if you've got research support officers, they're well placed to kind of do that. They might not have all the knowledge and skills to do it, but we can help them do that. So we're trying to, in many ways, we took that approach rather than having a kind of a network of champions or digital literacy champions across the institution. We did start off by doing that, but what we rapidly ended up with was a special interest group where it's not an argument for not doing it, but we got people were coming who were interested in the technology and education, things like that, but we weren't necessarily getting the cascade once they went back to their schools and departments, and the conversations weren't happening as well as we'd hoped. So this approach, using these online forums, is an alternative to kind of the Champions Network. It's as well as rather than instead of.
I'd like to mention the A word, assessment. Do you know do you have any example whereby a lecturer has been working with you, for example, regarding research essays and with full referencing, and he would like his students to use a specific bibliographical software like Mendeley or Zotero, whereby you took part in the training of students, and in fact the use of the specific software or the recommended software is taken into account in the assessment? Or is there a conversation regarding that kind of pilot or...
I might actually refer to Kathy. Do you know anything more in detail about this? I know that we run training courses on those tools, but in terms of actually how that dialogue happens between, generally it's subject librarians who are running the kind of training courses. But,
Yeah, I'm not aware of exactly the thing that you've talked about. And I think my question would then be, are you trying to assess the practice or the skill? If you're actually going to then assess, are they using that tool correctly? Or is the actual important thing that they're referencing correctly?
Well, because there's an overlap, you want the students to use it properly, but the great thing about this software is that the reference can be shared, across the group, across the course. So then you build up a body of reference article or reference sources, which can be built up over a couple of years. So you do two things at the same time. You enhance cognitive skill as well as the skills of IT skills of using the software, which is not that user friendly, in fact.
we definitely do the education training around the social aspects of using bibliographic databases and making people, especially with the researchers. But what I don't know about is how the assessment side of that comes into it. Janet, do you?
Yeah, no, I don't know any particular examples about assessment, but I do know that from the discussions, those conversations that we're having with the planning and geography school, one of the things that they actually requested was a session on using social citation, and so that was provided through the subject librarians. We supported that, and that hopefully will then be feeding out to students. So I think possibly the answer is somewhat in that direction, but not fully what you've just described.
My question is, according to the organization you have been presenting, in general you have service providers in a group, and I think you are asking about, you are looking for a conversation with academics. Why not to have a service provider within departments? And I think it's because I am more in the academic side, and some of the questions, some of the issues you present, they need to ask us. Sometimes we don't know what to ask.
Yeah.
But maybe I want to make changes in my classes, and I would like to have some, information about what is outside, and I don't know. And that is something part of the problem, that what is there, we don't know, so sometimes we don't know what to ask.
Yes.
So it will be very useful to have people that know. For example, I am in the language department, someone who knows about language teaching, and goes around and comes to the department to say, are you interested? I think for me that will be much more useful, that having general services for the whole university that sometimes they don't fit the purposes of we are looking for.
No, and I mean, that's the perennial problem, is that the expertise is dispersed across the institution. What we're hoping, and the reason for having this social platform, is we can get the communication happening across the services, so we can get expertise being drawn in where it's needed. And also that if something happens within a particular area, that we can actually take the results of that and make somebody else aware of it. At the moment, without having that kind of environment, there is no way of doing it. It's by incidental word of mouth, you know. And what we've got to do is try and, as I said with those librarians, what they want to do is actually make people aware of what their expertise is. So one of the challenges is increasing awareness about what I can do. I'm available to come and help you, but the first bit is actually how do you get that message out there? But I completely take on board what you're saying. In fact, we do have support people in some of the schools. So we do have technical people, and we have the subject librarians actually in the schools working together. The problem is it's not all the same for all of the schools. So some do better than others. So we want to try and help others as well. So I think the communication side of it is going to be critical, really.
I was just interested in the whole core task thing. I guess I should declare an interest because we're designing with the government a kind of scheme for digital skills in the population. So not information skills, but digital skills, which goes across a whole kind of different range of things. So we said, okay, let's not start with skill, let's start with practices, or as we talk about it, different areas of engagement with technology. And this exact same problem has been what we've been coming across. Like, as soon as you start thinking about the practice, it's really difficult to disentangle what is basic and what is advanced, because they're all mingled up in these tasks, which in the end is what you want people to be able to do. And it wasn't necessarily clear to me that inserting the core tasks in the middle of the period solved that problem. So I was wondering if you maybe could talk a little bit more about what making that explicit in the middle of the pyramid actually in practice did for you to make your task easier.
I think it's a bit early to say what it does in practice, because that's something that we've kind of proposing as a result of the discussions that we've had previously. So, but I do think that defining those core tasks as building blocks would allow us, the way that we're envisaging using it, and our next phase is to work with the school to use it in discussing how they're going to develop their e-learning approach, is to use them in a way as prompt cards. So we might define the elements of a particular task and use those as building blocks to allow us to discuss. So if somebody says, well, what I want my students to be able to do is do this particular type of presentation, then we can unpick what the different core tasks are for that, and then be able to point them to the literacies that they'll need for those core tasks. Does that make sense? And we'll use that as a prompt thing. We've got to finish.